It feels like I married the whole family, my daughter-in-law said, her voice light, almost amused, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of the woman sitting across from her. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, because the dining table was still set with the plates I had carefully arranged, the roast still warm in the center, the glasses catching the soft yellow light from the chandelier. Everything exactly the way it had been for years, for decades, for every Sunday. Dinner that I believed meant something. But then I looked at my son, Daniel, and he didn't look at me, not even once, his eyes fixed on his plate as if the green beans suddenly required his full attention. And that was when I understood that I hadn't misheard anything at all, that the sentence had landed exactly where it was meant to land, right in the middle of the room, right in the middle of me, and yet I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her what she meant, because somehow, asking would have made it smaller. And this was not small. This was something that had been building for a long time, something I had felt in the way conversations stopped when I entered the room, in the way plans were made without including me, in the way my own house had begun to feel like a place I needed permission to exist in. So instead, I picked up my napkin, folded it slowly, placed it beside my untouched plate, and stood up, and the sound of my chair sliding back against the hardwood floor seemed louder than it should have been, or maybe everything else had just gone quiet. I couldn't tell anymore, but no one said my name. No one asked me to stay, not even Daniel. And that was the part that settled into my chest like something final, something that didn't need to be said out loud. I walked upstairs without rushing, my hand brushing lightly against the banister I had polished every spring for the last 20 years. Each step familiar, each step heavier than the last. And when I reached my bedroom, I closed the door gently behind me, as if I were careful not to disturb something that was already broken. The room looked exactly the same as it had that morning, the bed neatly made, the curtains half drawn, the photograph of my late husband still on the nightstand, his smile frozen in a time when this house still felt like ours. I stood there for a long moment, not crying, not even angry, just aware of how quiet everything was, aware of how clear things had suddenly become, because 2 days earlier, I had opened a drawer I was never meant to open, and I had seen papers I was never meant to see, documents with signatures and dates, and numbers that didn't include me anymore, plans that had already been set in motion, and suddenly, that sentence at the dinner table wasn't just a careless remark. It was confirmation. It was the final piece falling into place. And so I walked to the closet, pulled out my suitcase, and set it on the bed, not because I was running away, not because I was defeated, but because for the first time in a very long time, I understood exactly what they thought they were doing, and more importantly, I understood exactly what I was about to do next. I did not rush, not even when my hands began to tremble slightly as I opened the top drawer and reached for the small stack of documents I had quietly returned there 2 days ago, placing them exactly the way I had found them so no one would suspect I had ever seen them. Because that was the thing about people who believed they were in control. They stopped being careful. They left traces, small ones, but enough. And I had learned long ago that small details could tell you everything if you were willing to look closely. I sat down on the edge of the bed and unfolded the first page again. Even though I already knew every line, every number, every signature, the property transfer draft with Daniel's name prepared neatly where mine should have been, the notes about restructuring accounts, the quiet language about making things simpler and more efficient. Words that sounded harmless until you realized they were describing a life being rearranged without your consent. I ran my fingers lightly over the paper, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because suddenly all those moments over the past year made sense. The closed door, conversations that stopped when I walked into the kitchen, the polite smiles that never reached Jessica's eyes, the way Daniel had started saying things like, "We are thinking," instead of "I think," as if he had already moved himself onto a different side of the table without ever telling me. I placed the documents back down carefully and opened my suitcase, the zipper sound cutting through the silence of the room, steady, deliberate. I folded my clothes the same way I always had, neat, precise, stacking them in quiet rows as if I were preparing for a short trip, not the end of something that had defined most of my adult life. But I did not let my mind wander into that kind of thinking, because this was not about loss anymore, not in the way they expected it to be. This was about clarity, about seeing the situation for exactly what it was without softening it, without making excuses for anyone. I paused when I reached the photograph on my nightstand, the one of my husband standing on the front porch, his arm resting casually on the railing he had built with his own hands. I remembered the day we took that picture. The sun was too bright, and he had squinted slightly, laughing when I told him to stand still, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel that memory fully, not as something painful, but as something solid, something that reminded me that this house, this life, had not been something temporary. It had been built, intentionally, carefully, over decades, and no quiet conversation at a dinner table could erase that truth. I placed the photograph gently into the suitcase and closed it halfway, leaving enough space for the things I would take last, the essentials, the things that mattered. Downstairs I could hear faint movement, the clink of dishes, Jessica's voice low and controlled, Daniel responding with something I could not quite make out, and I realized they were not coming upstairs, not to check on me, not to ask if I was all right, not to reconsider. What had just happened, and that absence, more than anything, confirmed what I needed to know. I stood up and looked around the room one last time, not with nostalgia, but with a quiet kind of assessment, noting what would stay, what would go, what still belonged to me in ways that could not be rewritten by paperwork or convenience. I reached for my coat, draped neatly over the chair, and slipped it on, the familiar weight settling around my shoulders, grounding me. I picked up the suitcase and walked toward the door, my steps steady, measured, each one carrying me further away from the version of myself that had spent too long waiting to be included, too long assuming that silence meant peace, instead of avoidance. As I opened the bedroom door, the light from the hallway spilled in, soft and ordinary, and for a brief second, I stood there, not hesitating, but acknowledging the moment for what it was, not an ending, but a shift, a quiet turning point that no one downstairs seemed to understand yet. But they would, soon enough. They would understand that I had not left because I had nowhere else to go. I had left because I finally saw exactly where I stood, and more importantly, exactly where they did not expect me to stand next. I stepped out into the night air and closed the front door behind me without looking back, not because I was afraid of what I might feel if I did, but because I already knew that nothing waiting for me inside that house would change. The porch light cast a soft glow over the driveway, the same light my husband had insisted on installing years ago, so I would never have to walk into darkness. And for a moment I stood there with my suitcase beside me, breathing in the quiet, letting the stillness settle around me in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely steady. I walked to my car, placed the suitcase in the trunk, and slid into the driver's seat, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel before I turned the key. The engine started with a low hum, dependable, predictable, unlike everything else that had shifted so quietly behind me. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, the tires rolling over the pavement I had walked across thousands of times, and as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I did not feel the urge to stop, not even once. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before I reached the small apartment I had arranged earlier that afternoon, a place I had chosen not out of desperation, but out of intention, clean, simple, temporary, a space where no one else had a say in whether I belonged. I carried my suitcase inside, set it down near the door, and turned on the light. The room was quiet, empty. Waiting, I walked to the window and looked out at the street below, a couple of cars passing by, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds, steady, grounding. I placed my purse on the small kitchen counter and took out my phone, the screen lighting up in my hand. No missed calls, no messages, not from Daniel, not from anyone, and I realized that this silence was not new. It had simply become more visible now that I was no longer inside the illusion of togetherness. I set the phone down and opened my suitcase, pulling out only what I needed for the night, a change of clothes, my toiletries. The photograph I had placed carefully on top, I set it on the nightstand beside the bed, adjusting it until it sat just right, as if placing it there marked the beginning of something instead of the end. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let my thoughts move back to earlier that week, to the moment I had first noticed something was off, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of subtle shift that most people ignore, the way Jessica had started asking questions about the house that did not feel like curiosity, but like evaluation, the way Daniel had brushed off my suggestions about small repairs, saying they would handle it later, always without including me. And then that afternoon when I had gone looking for a document and found the drawer slightly open, just enough to draw my attention, just enough for me to see the edge of the papers inside. I had not intended to read them at first, but something in me had already begun to understand that I needed to, that ignoring it would not protect me. It would only delay the moment I was now living through. I stood up and walked to the small desk near the window, opening my purse again and taking out a folded card, the name of the attorney my husband and I had worked with. Years ago, someone who knew exactly how we had structured everything, someone who understood that nothing in our lives had ever been left to chance. I placed the card on the desk and ran my fingers over the embossed letters, steady, deliberate, and for the first time since I had walked out of that house, I allowed myself a small, quiet realization. They believed I had left with nothing, that I had accepted what they had decided for me, that I would simply disappear into whatever space they had imagined I belonged in. But they had not asked the right questions, they had not looked closely enough, and they had certainly not considered what happens when someone who has been underestimated finally stops explaining themselves. I turned off the light beside the bed and lay down, the room settling into darkness around me. Not heavy, not suffocating, just still. And as I closed my eyes, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about timing, about patience, about the fact that everything they had planned depended on one assumption, that I would not act. And that was the only part of their plan that was already beginning to fall apart. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the kind of early morning quiet that used to belong to routines I had followed for decades. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, footsteps on familiar floors, small conversations that filled the spaces between tasks. But now there was only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint light coming through the window, and I realized that for the first time in a long time. Nothing in this day had been decided for me by anyone else. I sat up slowly, not rushing, not reaching for my phone, because I already knew it would still be silent. Instead, I walked to the small kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood by the window, watching as the street began to come to life. People heading to work, cars moving in steady lines, everything continuing exactly as it always had, as if nothing had shifted at all, and yet everything had. I took a sip and let my thoughts settle into place, not scattered, not emotional, but clear, organized, the way they used to be when my husband and I would sit at the dining table with papers spread out in front of us, planning, discussing, making decisions that were meant to last. I finished my coffee, set the cup down, and walked over to the desk where I had left the attorney's card the night before. I picked it up and read the name again, slowly, deliberately, remembering the last time we had sat in his office, the way my husband had insisted on reviewing every detail twice, not out of fear, but out of principle. He had always believed that clarity was a form of protection, that understanding what you had built was just as important as building it. I reached for my phone and dialed the number, listening to the steady ring on the other end, each second stretching just enough to remind me that this was the moment where things would begin to move forward. When the call was answered, I introduced myself calmly, stating my name, my situation, and asking for a meeting, not explaining more than necessary, because I did not need to. Not yet. The appointment was set for later that morning, and I ended the call with a simple thank you, placing the phone back on the desk with steady hands. There was no rush in my movements, no urgency that might suggest panic or uncertainty, because this was neither. This was a continuation of something that had already been set in motion the moment I chose to look at those documents instead of ignoring them. I dressed carefully, choosing simple, neutral clothes, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would distract from what needed to be done. And as I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see someone who had been pushed out. I saw someone who had stepped aside at exactly the right time. I gathered my things, took one last look around the apartment, and left. The drive to the attorney's office took about 15 minutes. The streets more crowded now, the day fully underway, and as I parked the car and stepped out, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me. Not anger, not resentment, but resolve. The office building looked exactly the same as I remembered. The same glass doors, the same quiet lobby, the same sense of order that had always reassured me. I checked in at the front desk and was asked to wait. So I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, observing the room without appearing to do so. The people moving in and out, the quiet conversations, the steady rhythm of a place where decisions were made carefully, intentionally. After a few minutes, I was called into the office, and when I stepped inside, I was greeted with recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but a quiet understanding that told me I had come to the right place. I took a seat across from the desk and placed my purse beside me, not opening it yet, not revealing anything prematurely, because timing mattered. It always had. And as the conversation began, I spoke clearly, outlining only the facts, the house, the documents I had seen, the changes that had been prepared without my knowledge, and I watched carefully as each piece was acknowledged, considered, understood. There were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions, just a steady unfolding of information that confirmed what I already knew, that nothing had been finalized yet, that signatures mattered, that ownership was not something that could be quietly rewritten without consequence. And as I listened, I felt the last trace of uncertainty disappear, replaced by something far more precise, a plan not built on emotion, but on structure, on legality, on the very systems they had assumed I would never think to question. When the meeting ended, I stood up, thanked him again, and stepped back into the hallway, the world outside, continuing as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. But I was aware, completely. And as I walked out of the building, I understood that they still believed they were ahead, that they were waiting for me to disappear quietly into the space they had prepared for me. But what they did not understand was that I had never stopped paying attention, not to the details, not to the decisions, and certainly not to the moment when everything they had planned would begin to turn in a direction they had never anticipated. When I stepped out of the building, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if something that had been clouded for a long time had finally settled into focus. I walked to my car without rushing, my steps steady, measured, the same way they had been when I walked out of that house. But now there was something else beneath that calm, something structured, something intentional. I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door, resting my hands on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine, not because I needed to gather myself, but because I was already thinking 3 steps ahead, the conversation I had just had, replaying in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically, each detail falling into place exactly where it belonged. The attorney had confirmed what I had suspected, that the house was not simply something that could be transferred with a few quiet signatures, that the accounts tied to it were layered, protected, and most importantly, that my consent was not optional. It was required, and without it, everything they had prepared remained exactly what it was, unfinished, incomplete. I drove back to the apartment slowly, taking a different route than before, not out of necessity, but out of habit, the kind of habit that comes from years of managing things carefully, observing patterns, adjusting without drawing attention. When I arrived, I carried nothing with me except my purse, leaving the rest as it was, untouched, because there was no need to change anything yet. Timing mattered. I stepped inside, closed the door, and moved directly to the desk, taking out a small notepad and a pen, writing down everything that had been confirmed, not because I might forget, but because putting it into words made it concrete. The structure of what I was dealing with, the house, the joint accounts, the secondary accounts that had been set up years ago, the clauses that protected ownership, the signatures that had not been given. I paused for a moment, tapping the pen lightly against the paper, and then added one more line. Something simple, something clear. They assumed I would not act. I set the pen down and looked at the list, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was not about proving them wrong. This was about understanding exactly how far they had already gone and how far they believed they could still go. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Daniel's name, my thumb hovering over it for a second before I locked the screen and set the phone back down. Not yet. There was nothing to say that would change anything at this stage. Words were not the tool I needed right now. Action was quiet, precise action. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the street, watching as people moved through their day without hesitation, without second-guessing their place in the world around them. And I realized that was exactly what had been taken from me inside that house. Not space, not comfort, but certainty, the quiet understanding that I belonged there without question. And now that certainty had shifted, not because they had the power to take it, but because I had allowed it to be defined by their behavior. And that was something I would not do again. I turned away from the window and went back to the desk. Opening my purse once more and taking out a small envelope I had not looked at in years, placing it on the surface and sliding my finger under the flap, opening it carefully. Inside were copies of older documents, ones that predated everything Daniel and Jessica had tried to arrange, ones that reflected decisions made long before their involvement. I laid them out side by side, comparing them to what I had seen in that drawer, and the differences were not subtle, they were fundamental. Ownership, authority, access, all clearly defined in ways that could not be quietly rewritten without leaving a trail. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, not out of pride, but out of recognition that what had been built over decades had not been as fragile as they believed. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the envelope, sealing it again. Then I reached for my phone one more time, this time opening a new message, not to Daniel, not to Jessica, but to the attorney, a simple confirmation, moving forward as discussed, no urgency in the wording, no emotion, just intent. I sent the message and set the phone down. The room quiet around me once again, but this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt controlled, deliberate, and as I stood there, I understood that from this point on, everything would unfold not because of what they said or did, but because of what I chose to do next, and they would not see it coming, not because it was hidden, but because they had never truly considered that I was paying attention all along. I did not expect the response to come so quickly, but it did. A brief message from the attorney confirming that the preliminary steps had already been initiated, that certain access points had been reviewed, and that no further movement on any property or account could occur without direct authorization. My authorization, I read the message twice, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to understand the weight of it, the quiet shift it represented. This was not confrontation, not yet. This was containment. A controlled pause placed directly in the path of everything they believed was already moving forward. I set the phone down and allowed the silence in the room to settle around me again, but this time it carried a different tone, not uncertainty, not waiting, but readiness. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee, moving through the small space with the same calm precision I had used for years. But now each action felt deliberate in a way it had not before, as if I were no longer simply living inside my life, but actively shaping what came next. I sat at the small table and took a slow sip, letting my thoughts move ahead, not backward, because looking back no longer served any purpose. Everything I needed to know was already clear. What mattered now was timing, sequence, the order in which things would unfold. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup, placing it carefully in the sink. Then I reached for my phone again, not to call Daniel, not to respond to anything that might come from him, but to check something else entirely. I opened the banking application and reviewed the accounts, not hurriedly, not nervously, but methodically, each number, each transaction, each detail confirming what the attorney had said. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed, everything remained exactly where it had been before they attempted to rearrange it. And that stillness, that lack of movement, told me more than any conversation could have. It meant they were waiting for me to step aside completely, waiting for me to make it easy, waiting for silence to do their work for them. I closed the application and set the phone down again, a small, almost invisible shift forming in my thoughts, not reactive, not defensive, but strategic. I stood up and walked back to the desk, pulling out the notepad once more, adding a few more lines beneath what I had already written: timeline, documentation, verification, each word simple, direct, but carrying weight. I paused and looked at the page, then added one more: communication, not now, later. I underlined it once, not heavily, just enough to mark its place, because I knew there would be a moment when words would matter, when something would need to be said, but that moment had not arrived yet, and forcing it would only disrupt the balance I had just begun to establish. I set the pen down and leaned back slightly, my gaze drifting toward the window again, the light outside now brighter, the day fully in motion, and I wondered briefly what was happening back at the house, not with emotion, but with curiosity. Had they noticed anything yet? Had Jessica mentioned something to Daniel? Had he checked anything? Or were they still sitting in that same quiet confidence? believing everything was proceeding exactly as they had planned. I did not reach for my phone to find out, because their awareness was not something I needed to measure, not yet. Instead, I turned my attention back to what I could control: the sequence, the preparation, the quiet reinforcement of every position they had tried to weaken. I gathered the documents from the envelope once more and placed them neatly into a folder, labeling it with a simple, unassuming word, personal, and set it aside within reach, not hidden, not exposed, just ready. I moved through the apartment once more, adjusting small things, aligning objects, creating a sense of order that matched the clarity forming in my mind. And as I paused near the door, my hand resting lightly against the frame, I felt something settle into place completely, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet certainty. They believed this was about pushing me out, about making space for themselves, about simplifying their lives. But what they had not considered was that in trying to remove me, they had revealed exactly how much still depended on me, and that dependence, hidden beneath their confidence, was not something I would ignore. It was something I would use, carefully, precisely, and at exactly the right moment. It was not until late that afternoon that the first sign appeared, not dramatic, not loud, just a small vibration of my phone against the table, a single call, Daniel's name lighting up the screen. I looked at it for a moment without reaching for it, letting it ring until it stopped, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, because timing mattered more than reaction. A second later, a message followed, simple, almost casual, asking where I was, as if I had stepped out for groceries and forgotten to mention it. I read it once and set the phone back down, not answering. Not yet, because the tone told me everything I needed to know. They had noticed my absence, but they had not yet understood its meaning. I stood by the window, watching the light begin to soften as the afternoon shifted toward evening, and I allowed the silence to stretch, not empty, but purposeful. Minutes passed, then another message appeared, this one slightly sharper, asking if everything was all right, the phrasing careful, but the impatience underneath beginning to show. I picked up the phone this time and typed a response slowly, deliberately. I am fine. I will be in touch soon. Nothing more, nothing less. I sent it and placed the phone back down. The words simple, but enough to change the balance, because now they knew I was not unreachable, only unavailable on their terms. I turned back to the desk and opened the folder I had prepared earlier, reviewing the documents once more, not searching for anything new, but reinforcing what I already understood: the structure, the ownership, the limits they had unknowingly placed on themselves. As I traced the lines with my eyes, I could almost see the moment when their confidence would begin to shift, when realization would replace assumption, and that moment was closer than they thought. The phone remained quiet for nearly an hour after my reply, and I imagined the conversations happening without me. Jessica asking questions, Daniel checking things, small uncertainties beginning to form where certainty had once been. I did not need to hear it to know it was happening, because uncertainty has a pattern. It starts quietly, almost invisibly, and then it grows, filling the spaces left by overconfidence. I closed the folder and set it aside, then moved through the apartment with the same steady rhythm, preparing a simple dinner, something small, something ordinary, because there was no need to disrupt my routine. Not anymore. Routine was control, and control was exactly what I had taken back. As I sat down to eat, the phone lit up again, this time a call, not a message, and I let it ring once more, not out of avoidance, but because I was not ready to give them access to my voice yet. When it stopped, another message followed, shorter now, more direct. We need to talk. I read it and placed the phone face down on the table, not ignoring it, simply deciding its place in the sequence, because this conversation, whenever it happened, would not be on their terms. It would not be reactive. It would not be shaped by urgency or pressure. It would happen when everything was already in position, when every detail had been confirmed, when every assumption they held had been quietly dismantled without them even realizing it. I finished my meal and cleared the table, moving with the same calm precision, and as I washed the dishes, I felt the shift more clearly than before, not in them, but in myself, the absence of hesitation, the absence of doubt, replaced by something steady, something grounded. I dried my hands and walked back to the desk, picking up the phone once more, not to respond, but to set the next step in motion. I opened my messages to the attorney and typed a brief update. They have reached out. We proceed as planned. I sent it without pause and set the phone down again. The room quiet around me, the evening settling in. And as I stood there, I understood that this was the moment where their version of events began to break apart. Not because I confronted them, not because I explained anything, but because I did not, because I allowed their uncertainty to grow, to expand, to reshape everything they thought they controlled. And by the time we finally sat down to talk, it would no longer be about what they wanted. It would be about what remained, and what remained was not what they expected. The next morning arrived without urgency, the light filtering through the window in the same quiet way as the day before. But there was a difference now, something subtle but unmistakable, because this time I knew exactly what would happen. Not every word, not every reaction, but the direction, the shift, the moment when everything they believed would begin to turn. I dressed carefully, choosing the same kind of calm, neutral appearance. Nothing that would signal confrontation, nothing that would suggest emotion, because this was not about how I felt. It was about what I knew. I picked up the folder from the desk, holding it lightly in my hand as I stepped out of the apartment and into the morning air. The drive back to the house felt shorter than before, not because the distance had changed, but because my perspective had. I parked in the same spot I had used for years and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment in the stillness, not gathering courage, but confirming intention. Then I stepped out and walked toward the front door, my steps steady, measured, familiar. I opened the door without knocking, because I still could, and the sound of it drew immediate attention. Jessica appeared first, her expression shifting from surprise to something tighter, something controlled. Daniel followed a second later, his face carrying a mix of concern and something else he had not yet named. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, placing my purse gently on the table, the same table where everything had begun to unravel. And for a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but revealing, because it gave them time to fill it with their own assumptions. I looked at them both, not searching, not questioning, simply observing. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice measured, asking where I had been. As if the question itself could restore some sense of order, I answered simply, I needed time. Nothing more, nothing less. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his tone softer, asking if everything was all right, and I nodded once, not offering explanation. Because explanation was not what this moment required, I reached into the folder and placed it on the table, opening it carefully. The papers inside laid out with precision, each page aligned, each detail visible. I did not push them forward. I did not point to anything. I simply let them sit there, available, undeniable. Jessica's eyes moved first, scanning the pages quickly, then more slowly, her expression tightening further as recognition began to replace confidence. Daniel looked between her and the documents, his brow furrowing, his silence no longer passive, but uncertain. I allowed the moment to unfold without interruption, because this was where understanding began, not through words, but through realization. Finally, Daniel reached for one of the pages, reading it more carefully, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as he absorbed what it meant. The ownership, the requirements, the signatures that had not been given, the process that had not been completed. Jessica spoke again, this time with less control, asking what this was, why. I had it, and I met her gaze calmly, my voice even. This is what you thought you could change. I did not raise my voice. I did not add emphasis, because the words did not need it. The truth carried its own weight. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing something he had overlooked for a long time. And I held his gaze without softening, without offering reassurance, because this was not a moment for comfort. It was a moment for clarity. I closed the folder gently, not removing it, just signaling that what needed to be seen had already been seen. And then I spoke again, my tone steady, controlled. Nothing has been transferred, nothing has been changed, and nothing will be, not. Without me, the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And for the first time since I had walked back into that house, neither of them had anything immediate to say, because what they were facing was not an argument, not a misunderstanding, but a boundary, one that had always existed, one they had simply chosen to ignore until now. The silence that followed did not break immediately. It lingered, stretching across the room in a way that made every small movement feel louder than it should have been. Daniel still holding the paper in his hand, Jessica standing beside him, her posture no longer confident but rigid, as if she were trying to hold together something that had already begun to shift. I did not rush to fill that silence. I let it settle, because this was not a moment that needed explanation. It was a moment that needed to be understood. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice lower now, uncertain in a way I had not heard before, asking why I had not said anything earlier, why I had not come to him. And I looked at him steadily, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity, because the answer was not complicated. I did not need to say anything earlier. I said quietly, "You had already made your decisions." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that neither of them could ignore. Jessica shifted slightly, her voice sharper now, trying to regain control of the conversation, saying that it was not what it looked like, that they were only trying to plan ahead, to make things easier. And I listened without interrupting, not because I believed her, but because I wanted her to finish, to say everything she needed to say, to reveal the shape of her reasoning completely. When she stopped, I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them, and then I spoke again, just as calmly as before. Planning does not require removing someone from their own life. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what was already evident, and that was enough. Daniel looked down at the papers again, his grip loosening slightly, the certainty he had held on to beginning to dissolve. As the reality of the situation settled in, I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted, in the way his silence changed from passive to reflective, and for a brief moment, I saw something else there too, something like regret, but I did not move toward it. I did not soften my stance, because regret, when it comes too late, does not change what has already been set in motion. I reached forward and closed the folder gently, sliding it back toward me, not as a gesture of taking something away, but as a signal that the discussion, at least on their terms, was over. "I am not here to argue," I said, my tone even, controlled. "I am here to be clear." I let that settle for a moment before continuing. "Nothing changes without me. Not the house, not the accounts, not the decisions you thought you had already made." Jessica opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out this time, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to reinterpret. The facts had already been placed in front of them. Daniel finally set the paper down on the table, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and when he looked at me again, the question in his eyes was different, not defensive, not dismissive, but searching, as if he were trying to understand how things had reached this point without him fully noticing. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, not out of avoidance, but because I had already said everything that needed to be said. I picked up my purse and the folder, holding them lightly at my side, and turned toward the door, not waiting for permission, not expecting anyone to stop me, because this time, my leaving was not a reaction, it was a decision. I opened the door and stepped outside, the air cool against my skin, the same porch, the same driveway, but everything felt different now, not because the place had changed, but because I had. I walked to my car and placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat before getting in, and as I started the engine, I did not look back at the house, not because I was avoiding it, but because I no longer needed to. Whatever that house had represented before, it no longer defined where I stood. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, the movement steady, controlled, and as I drove away, there was no sense of loss, no lingering hesitation, only a quiet, settled understanding. Respect is not something you are given by staying silent. It is something that becomes clear the moment you decide you are no longer willing to be overlooked, and by the time they fully understood that, I was already gone, not from the family, not from the story, but from the place they had expected me to remain.